Another day, another scandal for Reform UK. And yes, it's donations yet again. But this time, it's not the Parliamentary Standards Committee that's leading the inquiry. It's the police. The BBC and the iPaper have reported that Reform MP Robert Jenrick is being investigated by the Metropolitan Police over a donation he received during his unsuccessful campaign for the Conservative Party leadership in 2024. You remember, of course, that he defected from the Tories to Reform in January. The investigation relates to a donation of £100,000 for Jenrick's leadership campaign received from British entrepreneur Philip Ullman via a company called Spot Fitness, the iPaper said. But here's the sticky part. It's reported that £37,500 of the amount came from US company Innoviz. That company is owned by a business associate of Ullman's, Gary Klopfenstein. And Klopfenstein pleaded guilty to committing wire fraud in an unrelated case in 2024. So far, so potentially murky. Now, the reason the police are involved is that it is illegal under electoral law for British politicians to receive foreign donations. The Metropolitan Police confirmed it had opened an investigation connected to a political party's leadership campaign after a referral from the Electoral Commission watchdog, which had first looked into the accusations. It did not name who it was investigating. Jenrick has, however, denied any wrongdoing. A spokesperson for the MP told the BBC the following. The suggestion that Robert knowingly accepted impermissible donations is an untrue, politically motivated smear, put about years later by the Conservatives, despite the fact that Mr. Ullman was introduced to Robert by a Tory MP and had his donations permissibility checked by the party. Robert and his campaign team complied with all electoral laws when receiving this donation received from Spot Fitness Limited in 2024. Mr. Jenrick has never met, spoken to, nor had any contact with Mr. Klopfenstein, nor was he aware of any connection between him and Mr. Ullman's donation until he was contacted by the Electoral Commission. He fully cooperated with the Electoral Commission inquiry, providing detailed records that categorically disprove these smears in 2025. Jenrick himself has said that he has had no contact from the police. Now, over the last week, we've been treated to a car crash interview after car crash interview as Reform's leadership gamely tried to defend donations to Nigel Farage in his farcical by-election in Clacton. Reform MP Richard Tice, though, this morning didn't want to know unasked about Jenrick by independent journalist Jack Rowleth.
Just about Nigel?
It's a lovely morning.
Well, is Robert got ambitions to lead Reform one day, if you don't mind me asking?
It's a lovely morning. I'm just getting ready for a meeting, if that's okay with you.
Do you think...
If you want an interview, then phone the press office and they could organise something.
Well, the press office keep rejecting me, actually.
Oh, that's a shame.
John Gill is his name?
Well, there's a variety of people in the press office.
Anyway, I want to say as well, do you believe...
Who are you, by the way?
I'm Jack Rowleth, independent journalist. Do you think the NCA, do you think the National Crime Agency...
Who do you work for?
I'm independent. I've actually just landed a job this week, freelance.
Congratulations.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Do you think the NCA and National Crime Agency...
I'll take over with you. I've just got to get ready for my meeting, okay?
I can have a walk with you, this is a public place,
Fine.
Richard.
Thank you very much.
Well, Richard, it was nice meeting you. I know I'm not going to get anything out of you. Can I shake your hand? Come on.
Jenrick himself hasn't been shy about appearing across the media this week either, engaging in petulant tirades in defence of Farage. Take a look.
I hope that the people of Clacton will return Nigel. We don't know that for certain, but I hope that they will, and they'll do so by a strong majority. And that will send a very powerful signal to the other parties that, look, the stitch-up has failed.
What is the message to the wider electorate
Enough
that
of these
Nigel
games.
Farage can beat a field of one talking bin?
Well, the message is this. Nigel Farage had the courage to put himself up for a by-election, which very few people do in politics. Very few people do.
You didn't.
Well, quite. There's very few people do it.
He was jailed for 8 months. Is this the kind of person that Nigel Farage should be associated with?
It's just an old friend of his.
Right.
He's got no role in
Are you
reform.
friends with many convicted criminals out of interest?
Well, people do make mistakes in life.
But are you friends with any convicted criminals? Do you take money from them? Do you have your security paid for by them? Do you stay at their houses? Any convicted criminals
Nigel is
at all?
allowed to have a friend.
Are you sitting comfortably?
I am. That sounds ominous, Lisa, but go for it.
Oh, you're sitting comfortably, so I shall begin. Nigel Farage is a vile, repulsive individual. Everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie. As soon as his lips are moving, it's a lie. The fact that you are sticking up for him just shows what a person you are, because you didn't have a by-election. Reform is a busted flush, and you don't like it. The problem is, you forget that for 14 years, you was on the Conservative side, and it was you and your cohorts in the Conservative government that have ruined this country.
I watched the LBC clips there from Robert Jenrick being berated by members of the audience, and it reminded me of that episode of Alan Partridge where he's on the radio getting angry calls from farmers again and again and again and again and again. That's the only thing that can be reminded of. Like, Jenrick is really a politician with Partridge energy, with big Partridge energy. So Jenrick, as you can see in those clips, is not at all shy about having his arse handed to him, but he has been conspicuously quiet on this particular story so far. Dahlia, now it's been an avalanche of problems for reform right now. What does it say about the kind of people we're dealing with here? And is this the end? Is reform a busted flush, as that caller said?
Well, I think what it's really put into perspective for me is how much they fold under the slightest bit of media scrutiny, and how free of media scrutiny they have been up until this point. This is the first time that we are really seeing Nigel Farage and his various political vehicles that have existed over the years being actually tested. It's the first time, at least since Brexit, that we have seen a serious testing of Farage and his various political parties by the press, and for incredibly legitimate reasons. I mean, the press are notorious for going after politicians for very spurious reasons, in many senses. I mean, all of us who witnessed the Corbyn era can attest to that there are, Corbyn had people digging in to get his ex-wives to say something, or his ex-wife to say something negative about him, and would try and run a mile with that. This is not petty gossip. This is talking about, the actual breaking of important codes, the question of money in politics, the question of where does the loyalty of these politicians lie. This is really serious stuff. And the fact that they are failing to even answer the most rudimentary questions about potential or alleged corruption really shows how they have had such an easy ride by the press for so long. Not only has the press treated reform and Nigel Farage as this kind of wonder kid, but they have given Farage and others this sort of media platform that is completely disproportionate to their electoral significance. And what we are seeing as a result is they are trying to implement a kind of Trumpist playbook. They are trying to take this negative press and essentially use it to boost their anti-establishment credentials. We see this through, for example, Nigel Farage calling this by-election and talking about it being, an establishment versus the people by-election, and trying to say, the media are only coming after me because I'm anti-establishment, or because I represent a threat to the establishment. And that's the route that he and others are likely going down. But unfortunately, the whining is incredibly distasteful when you hear Nigel Farage saying, I am the most threatened, or I am the most at-risk MP that has ever lived, practically. And it's like, well, why don't you tell that to Diane Abbott, who receives 10 times the amount of abuse than the next most abused female MP in Parliament, or has had such graphic death threats that she is unable to walk around her constituency unprotected. What about telling that to the family of Joe Cox or David Ames, two MPs who were assassinated in office? This idea that just because you have had the most gentle form of questioning over whether or not your conduct is legal or illegal, the fact that you would consider that to be the most egregious attack on the safety and dignity of an MP, when we literally have got, when Diane Abbott is literally right there, or when we've had 2 assassinated MPs in the past 10 years, it just comes across as pretty snowflakey. And I thought that the reform electorate don't like that.
Well, the thing is that with people like Nigel Farage and Robert Jenrick, like people who've been privately educated, who've been in the upper echelons of society, they're not used to being questioned. They're not used to being held to account. They've lived above scrutiny and above accountability for basically all of their lives. That's been how they've understood themselves. And any amount of pushback is seen as being totally unreasonable, when normal people have to deal with scrutiny every day in our lives, right? Like members of the NHS can't accept donations of anything more expensive than a pen, and we're supposed to let £5 million just lie there as if it's completely irrelevant. I mean, there's a huge conflict of interest, even beyond parliamentary rules about the declaration of these gifts, right? And in terms of Nigel Farage trying to make the story all about the by-election, or all about Sky News spending time knocking on one of his doors, which he was registered to vote at, by the way, at the last election, like the one hounding his family, he was registered to vote there at the last election, perfectly reasonable for a journalist to make a request. And yet, you look at people on the left in this country, Zach Polanski had his whole family hunted down by the press to try and dig up dirt on him as an individual. I know every single detail of Jeremy Corbyn's front door from day after day after day that he was doorstepped by the press all the way through both election campaigns, all of the Brexit saga, all of that time of politics was squarely focused on the front door of one politician. Nigel Farage throws a temper tantrum over one knock from one journalist one time and an address he was registered at as part of his multiple property portfolio that he has apparently. And I'm supposed to be on his side. I'm supposed to think that he isn't anything other than a whinging snowflake because of this. And again, this is because when you're accustomed to privilege, equality, and accountability, it feels like oppression. They feel like they're being hard done by being treated like literally everybody else.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in a sense, these things are always bittersweet, Helena, for me, because yes, obviously, this is very serious. It is very serious, who funds our politicians and whether or not this is done in transparent ways and etc. But it is again frustrating that Nigel Farage, who has whipped up so much hostility and division and hatred and has made so many people's lives in this country so much harder for no good reason. People who keep this country running, and obviously I'm talking about immigrants and the children of immigrants, people who keep this country running and has made their lives so much worse in this country, and not to mention all of the various ways in which he, if he was to get into power, would be planning on making working class people's lives a living hell, whether it's through ripping up our employment rights, whether it's through privatizing the NHS through the back door, whether it's through crippling the welfare state. I wish that those were the kinds of things that could sink a politician. I wish that those were the kinds of things that the press really hounded our politicians about, of like, how is your worldview and how is your politics actually going to shape the lives of working class people in this country? And I always find it quite frustrating that the things that the press do take the politicians to task on tend to be these kind of, in the grand scheme of things, not as significant in my view. But I think this story does tell us something bigger. There is a bigger story within this sort of £5 million, which is a lot of money to someone like you and me, but in terms of the amount of money that's moving around in these kind of circles is kind of a drop in the ocean. The nugget of story within that is that the person who has fraudulently positioned themselves as an anti-establishment candidate and an anti-establishment politician is actually the most establishment of them all. He is one of the most, the one that most represents existing vested power and vested interests. And we can see that both in the fact that he is so flushed with money. People who are genuinely anti-establishment, people who are genuinely, counter-hegemonic, to use a kind of technical term, don't tend to have like billionaires and millionaires lining up to get them into political power. And also through the absolute sensitivity and shock that he displays at being treated like a normal member, like something approaching a normal member of the public when it comes to accountability, is such a shock to his system. The broader lesson here is that Nigel Farage is not just the establishment. He is like in the most protected, at the heart of some of the most vile parts of the establishment.
I'll finish off by saying one thing that really makes me angry is the hypocrisy. Now, I know it's not a real argument to point to hypocrisy, but he is hypocritical. Like, talking, as most right-wingers do, about supporting things like law and order. Like, Nigel Farage stood up at a podium, which literally had "Britain is lawless" written across the front of it. And whilst, of course, he hasn't broken any laws, not that we know of, and obviously Robert Jenrick has only been accused of being investigated potentially about whether or not things were legal, George Cottrell is a criminal. He did commit crimes. He is literally part of the whole lawless parts of Britain. But because it's white-collar crime, it gets washed under the rug, right? Because it's white-collar crime, no one pays attention. And yet we focus on blue-collar crime in this country heavily, and he continues to do it, despite the fact that that's going down. The only kind of crime that's really increasing in this country is fraud. And that's a white-collar crime, right? That's where a lot of the crime happens in this country, is fraudulent activity, you know? And the idea that somehow we should ignore this because it's when posh people do it is exactly what the establishment want. It's exactly what the establishment want, to take our eyes away from the kind of crimes that the rich do and then focus entirely on the people who are driven to crime through poverty and desperation. Now, thank you very much, Dahlia, for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me, Helena.
Always good to have Ladies' Night back, even if it is done remotely. And thank you everyone for tuning in at home as well. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.